So we've been running the Cold War for over a year now, and I've actually just been informed we haven't even started on Cuba yet. Can this be true? Huh, well, I guess we should end that particular embargo. See what I did there? Cuba, despite being a small island, played a massive role in the Cold War. It was a communist state less than 100 miles off the American coast, and the focal point of one of the most dangerous moments of the entire conflict. We'll be visiting Cuba several times over the course of this channel. I'm your host David, and today we are going to go into the history of this country and set up all the reasons why it took the course it did. Fix yourself a cubata and break out the cojibas. Esta es la Guerra Fría. Our story begins not like it usually does at the end of the Second World War, but rather in the late 19th century. The United States, through an accident and yellow journalism, found itself in a war with the decaying colonial empire of Spain. By that time, though, Cuba was already embroiled in a war of independence against their Spanish colonial masters. Their struggle had loomed heavily in the minds of the American people. Reports of Spanish atrocities, arguably exaggerated, increased the mood and desire for the US to intervene. Even after a change in Spanish policy towards Cuba, the toothpaste was well out of the tube. In response to fears of violence against Americans in Havana, the US dispatched the USS Maine in late January of 1898. The Maine, you will remember, was a US Navy armored cruiser. In what's now thought by historians to be an accidental ignition of coal gases, the Maine exploded just off the coast, killing over 200 American sailors and sinking the ship. The cause has not been established conclusively to this day, but at the time, it was definitely blamed on a sea mine placed by the Spanish. Americans freaked out and demanded a response from the government of US President William McKinley. Newspaper barons like William Randolph Hearst spread newspaper articles sowing a conspiracy that the Spanish sunk the Maine. As a quick aside, the character of Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane is based on Hearst, and there's a part of the movie which refers to this exact moment. Either way, back in the real world, McKinley and the leadership of the Republican Party didn't want a war. Still, the people were shouting, "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" Things changed when Senator Redfield Proctor gave his analysis, concluding that the US had to go to war to intervene, turning around most of the constituents opposing intervention. McKinley asked, and got permission from Congress soon after, to intervene in the Cuban Revolution. The resolution focused on independence for Cuba and a brief occupation until peace could be achieved. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. This was not a close war. The United States destroyed the Spanish occupation of Cuba and at the same time also invaded the Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Spain surrendered by July and signed a peace treaty granting Cuba its independence. Notable to point out here though, the leadership of Cuba's rebel force played no role at the peace treaty process in Paris, nor the actual surrender ceremonies. Weird. In 1902, the United States passed the Platt Amendment, which on May 20th gave the Cuban people formal independence. However, Cubans today do not consider this an actual moment of independence, and now we're going to go into all the reasons the Cubans are probably right about that. A year later, the Cuban government signed the Cuban-American Treaty of Relations, which leased Guantanamo Bay to the United States to use as a Caribbean military port, an apparent extra-constitutional prison with a questionable record on human rights torture, but that's a different video for a different channel. The Americans still hold this territory to this day, much to the dismay of the current Cuban government. One part of this treaty included a clause which gave the US the right to intervene for the, quote, preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, end quote. When Estrada Palma rigged the 1905 election, liberals rose up in revolt. Both factions asked the US to intervene. President Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley's old VP before his assassination, was reluctant to interfere. Without US aid, Palma decided to resign. The next day, Roosevelt's Secretary of War, William H. Taft, invoked the treaty to declare himself the provisionary leader of Cuba until they could have elections. US soldiers began an occupation of Cuba, which would last for several years. In 1909, the occupational governor of Cuba, Charles Magoon, decided the island was ready for elections. They went through, and Cuba had a new president, José Miguel Gómez, and with that, the occupation ended. What this showed is that the United States was fully ready to intervene in Cuban politics if and when they so desired. The period that followed was economically quite prosperous for Cuba. The First World War created a sugar shortage, so Cuba managed to make mad bank off their primary cash crop. Wait, mad bank? I'm getting too old for this. Anyway, not everything was rosy. One attempt to make a black republic led by the Partido Independiente de Color resulted in a brutal counterinsurgency in order to suppress the insurgency. And of course, there is the danger in relying on a single commodity like Cuba did. In 1920, the price of sugar crashed, and the Cuban economy crashed along with it. In this recession, foreign, primarily American corporations began to invest in the country and take ownership over many of the island's industries and businesses, meaning that money started to flow out of Cuba to piggy banks in New York, just like in a colony. But Cuba was totally not a colony. Right. In the 1920s, this got worse as Cuba opened to American tourism, with American-owned businesses opening around the country. With it came the rise of powerful organized crime, and Cuba also became a Caribbean Las Vegas, but before Las Vegas. Prostitution and gambling became growing segments of the economy. This is the second time I've been able to talk about blackjack and hookers. Anyway, the president at the time, Gerardo Machado, grew increasingly less popular and broke more and more promises in order to hang on to power. How could this get any worse? Well, spoiler, it got worse. The entire global economy crashed in 1929. Protest and even terrorist groups began to challenge the authority of the government, leading to repression as the economy began to crumble across the island nation. The US intervened with a threat of invasion in 1933 to force the president to make a change in government. A general strike forced Machado into exile and installed a temporary government led by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes y Quesada. This wasn't a military coup per se, but it was made up of a lot of soldiers. This was followed by another provisional government, followed by a takeover by a student organization. But while this government ran and held its own president, Ramon Grau San Martin, a man behind the scenes was put in charge of the military and, took effective control of the country. And this man was the military commander Fulgencio Batista. Let's talk a little bit about Batista. He was born in 1901 to veterans of the War of Independence. He came up in pretty modest conditions, working as a laborer since the age of 14. Eventually, he found his way into the military, where his skills as a stenographer helped him rise in the ranks. He was the secretary of the soldiers who participated in the 1933 coup. In the political chaos which followed, he rose to head of the military and was now de facto running the country. The Grau government was weak, and Batista, together with conspirators from the US, forced the president to resign in 1934, putting Carlos Mendieta in charge with recognition from Washington. Yes, the US supporting a military takeover of the government, a Cold War tale as old as time. This administration didn't even last the year. From 1934 to 1940, Cuba went through a string of weak presidents, while Batista really ruled as the military leader and strongman dictator of Cuba. But in 1940, Cuban politics would undergo a significant change. 1940 saw a new constitution which allowed unions and healthcare. Coinciding with the new constitution was an election for a new president. And who stood for president? Well, none other than Fulgencio Batista. Notably, he was the only non-white Cuban to run the country. Batista was a social democrat and used progressive reforms with a strong dose of capitalism to weave a happy relationship between a Cuban population that wanted significant improvements and the United States, which didn't want threats to their dominance over vast sectors of the Cuban economy. Hell, you know what? Even the communists liked him. Well, for a time anyway. Around the same time, though, Cuba also participated in the Second World War, playing a significant role in the Battle of the Caribbean. In 1944, the new constitution forbade Batista from running for another term, so he handpicked a successor, Carlos Rodriguez Zayas. Though, unfortunately for Batista, Grau defeated him in the election. After that, Batista pushed a hard reset on his life. He moved to the US, he divorced his wife, and remarried. Batista spent the next 8 years chilling in expensive hotels and houses between New York and Daytona Beach. It's suspected the copious amounts of money he had came from basically raiding the Cuban treasury before Grau could take office. He was even elected to the Cuban Senate from the US. But eventually, he decided to return to Cuba for another shot at the presidency. With permission from Grau, he formed a new political party and stood for the 1952 election. This didn't go great for Batista. His new party remained a weak third place in the polls. But our hero Batista was not going to let a little democracy get in the way of his desire to be president. With his friends in the army, he staged a coup a few months before the election. He ousted the president, canceled the election, and of course, the US soon after recognized his government. Cuba was, at the time of Batista's takeover, doing pretty well. It was one of the most developed states in Latin America, on par with some countries in Southern Europe. While wages did stay high under the Batista regime, it was marred by growing corruption and inequality. The rising tide did not raise all boats. 1 in 3 Cubans still lived in poverty. As well, American control of the economy and the role of organized crime deepened during the Batista regime with his support. American capitalists owned such a massive amount of the Cuban economy, it was hard to see it as anything but a colony. Leftists were not happy with the state of things, and I can think of no more prominent leftist who opposed the Batista regime than Fidel Castro. Let's give a bit of background since Castro is one of the more influential world leaders of the 20th century. He was born in 1926, the son of Canadian and Spanish immigrants to Cuba. Relatively well off, he went to good schools and became a lawyer. As part of the politically woke student movement, he got into activism surrounding anti-imperialism, especially against the United States. He had an intense career. He once participated in a militia group which was going to overthrow the dictator of the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo, but the Cuban government, at the behest of the US, forced them to stop. At a protest the next year, he got the crap kicked out of him by Cuban police as part of an anti-communist crackdown. He co-founded a law firm which worked with poor Cubans trying to find justice. Castro tried several times to challenge the Cuban legal system to make progressive change, but hit brick walls constantly. He even tried to make a run for local office when Batista's coup canceled elections. Violence seemed to be a last resort, but Castro appeared to be all out of resorts. Trying to find a way to end the military dictatorship of his country, Castro, alongside with his brother Raul, founded a resistance movement called the Movement. They began the process of getting weapons, training, and publishing newspapers to get ready for a coming revolution. Obviously, what comes next needs to be a video or 2 or 3 all on their own, so please come back soon to learn about how Cuba became a workers' paradise. Spoiler alert. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.